Here in what is perhaps not as strange a year as last year was, but is still somewhat a strange year in terms of having a in-person conference with lots of people in one room. Thank you everyone for bearing with us with our precautions and with the various questions that you were pestered with at the door. I know for me at least that all has become somewhat routine. I think I can do the CDC pre-screening questionnaire in my sleep at this point. And also thank you everybody for welcoming me. This is a big change for me to be in this role. It's one that I'm very excited, and I felt very welcomed into the community of folks who are doing this work and having made this transition. For those who don't know, I'm Sam Evans-Brown. I'm the new executive director of Clean Energy New Hampshire, and I've been in the role for almost 3 months. On Monday, it will be 3 months to the day. So the and I'd like to just say to everyone who's here, it's the people in this room that are making this all happen. It's you who are doing the work, and I felt very welcomed by you folks and the sponsors who are supporting this event. It is you all that is making our work possible. It is you all that is making this moment possible, and it really is this moment that has gotten me excited enough to leave my previous position at New Hampshire Public Radio and come here to really start doing this work. And when I think about the transition that I personally have made, there are a lot of reasons why I opted to make it, but it does come down to the fact that this decade, I think, is one that we will see the energy transition starting to accelerate in a way that will be really hard to comprehend from where we sit right now. And when we look back at that previous decade, it'll be a little bit baffling to explain to folks what it was that we were thinking in the 2010 to 2020 timeframe. And there's a couple anecdotes I just wanted to share that I think really highlight this. So I started as a reporter in 2013 at New Hampshire. Well, slightly before, but I started reporting on energy in 2013. And at that time, for those who remember, there were a series of wind projects that were proposed for around the Newfound Lake region of New Hampshire. And one of the points of pushback to the folks who didn't like those projects was that really we should be developing offshore wind. And that was the first time I heard a phrase that has become a little bit commonplace right now, that the east coast of the United States is the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. And so I was like, okay, that seems like a reasonable thing to look into. I'll look into it. Where are we with offshore wind? And everyone that I talked to, every sort of quote-unquote expert in the field of energy said, well, offshore wind is, it's a great idea, but it's really just too expensive. And terrestrial wind is where it's at because it's a much cheaper resource. And that's what all the experts told me. That's what I accepted. That's what I wrote in my stories. And then here we are, 2021, and in the next 10 years, we're expecting to see 30 gigawatts of offshore wind built off the east coast of the United States. And in fact, there's already nearly 20 that have been built in the North Sea and around the United Kingdom. And when I look back, and as I had the opportunity to do, because the last project that I worked on was a big series about offshore wind, when you look back, that 2013 timeframe in which I was being told that offshore wind was too expensive and was not likely to be a big part of our resource mix, was actually was the inflection point in which the cost of offshore wind was starting to decline dramatically in Europe. But people weren't seeing it yet because the future is hard to see, it's hard to predict. And I can go through a million of those types of anecdotes. I remember sitting on the exchange with Laura Kanoy, again talking about wind power and citing an NREL study that said that we could easily and without much change integrate 20% of our grid coming from variable renewable sources. And being told offline from folks that was crazy. That by the time we got to 20% variable renewable sources on the grid, we'd be seeing disruptions to power flow. We'd be seeing voltage regulation problems, and that it would be impossible to integrate that level. And lo and behold, again, 2021, here we are, where countries are well in excess of 20% of their energy coming from variable renewable sources without it impacting reliability or supply. So I tell these anecdotes because that is something of the focus of the talk that we're going to hear today from our keynote speaker. The keynote today is Elizabeth Wilson. She is a professor of environmental studies. She's the inaugural director of the Arthur Living Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth. Her study it focuses on how energy systems are changing in the face of new technologies and new societal pressures. And she's studying how institutions support or thwart energy system transitions and the interplays between technology, innovation, policy creation, and institutional decision making. I personally am really excited about this talk. I'm a bit of a nerd about this stuff. And there's a term that you might hear if you delve into the literature in which Elizabeth spends her time: socio-technical systems. I'm excited for those who don't know that term, for you to hear it today, to start thinking about it. I think it's a really powerful frame for understanding how society changes in the face of innovation. So I'd like you all to welcome to the stage Elizabeth Wilson.
Thank you, Sam. Super. Hi, does everyone hear me? We're good on sound? Good. Okay, Frank? We're good? Okay. So I should be in the system now? Good, okay. So I really wanted to thank you all for being here. This is my first kind of big event after, as we all know, a couple of years. And this is a really exciting conference. And the rest of the day, the panel, are you able to hear? Frank, do you want to adjust the sound? Are we good on sound now? There's some feedback that's coming in. I'd rather not if we could. Is that good? Is that better now? Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. So one of the things that you do have lined up today are a lot of really exciting talks about the local energy system here in New Hampshire, all of the changes, and that is absolutely critical. And so for my remarks today, I'm going to try and pull back, provide a larger context from which then you can go into the rest of the day. And so the structure of my remarks today will be first providing some context and then some bad news. But I was told a few years ago that you can't have a talk with just bad news because then people don't want to talk to you. So then we have some good news. And I have a few examples, ones of system change and also how challenging it is to do, and then summary. And then I really look forward to opening this up for a conversation with all of you. One of the things that I've appreciated is how in New England there are so many energy experts that work in this space at so many different levels, and that is absolutely essential. I came to Dartmouth 4 years ago. Before that, I'd been a professor at University of Minnesota. Before that, I'd lived in North Carolina and Belgium and Burundi. And that world perspective has really framed me. One thing I appreciate about this generation of students is they have learned about climate and climate change from the time they were in second grade. They are anxious, they are stressed out because they see the world around them coming apart at the edges. And one of the reasons I love working at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society is we're able to have those conversations together. And while sometimes it feels like climate change is crushing them, energy policy gives them something to push against, it gives them something to work towards, and it gives them something to think about to bring the world to a different place. And so I always start by telling them that climate policy is energy policy. If you want to address the climate issue, you have to address the energy system. And within that context, we have the global targets, the NDCs, Glasgow happening a little bit later this month. We have the national commitments that are happening at the country level, and then we have local implementation. That's where you come in. All implementation is local. And one of the things that's become very, very clear over the past year and a half especially is we're really good at grand goals, and local context and implementation is really, really hard. And as we know in New Hampshire, it can also be very, very divisive. And it's easy to say we can't afford something when really what we're saying is we don't want to do something. And so that context for change, I think, is really important. And I think New Hampshire is at a very exciting juncture point right now with the new local power coalition that Sam and many of you in this room have been involved with. April Salas, my colleague at Dartmouth, is in the small picture here. But I want to contrast that. Don, where are you? Raise your hand and wave at everybody. Our consumer advocate, Don Kreis, also pointing out that we're looking at drastic rate increases for electricity and natural gas. And so, saying that we're going to give you less and charge you more isn't really a winning political strategy. And so rethinking, how we in this area kind of frame our steps going forward, I think is really important. But to do that, I want to contextualize us within the grand challenge we're actually part of. The idea of net zero energy, keeping climate within 1.5 degrees, is really the goal. And that means reducing emissions by about 80%. Globally, 2019, we were about 60 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The US, with 5% of the population, is roughly 6 billion tons. To do net zero, we have to be less than 2, 1.5 to 2. That's a fundamental transformation of how we create energy and how we use energy. And just to, again, contextualize us globally, we're looking at a world of global energy use. This is put out every year by BP, where this circled proportion is the proportion of carbon-free energy in the system. Can you address the feedback issue, sir, please? And so recognizing that this is a time and a space, not only nationally, not only in New Hampshire, but around the world, where we're transforming how we have to think about energy, how we have to address energy, is really important. And I think in the United States, we're really good about thinking about how we think about energy locally in particular, but understanding that the conversations in the rest of the world are also driving very different conversations with very different risks, very different parameters. This chart shows you closest on this side is North America, farthest on that side is Asia Pacific, different regions of the world. Green is oil, red is natural gas, gray is coal. But you can see these different proportions of fossil energy use and renewables in different parts of the world. So while North America looks a lot like Europe, it looks very different from Asia. It looks very different from Africa and other parts of the world. And when we're thinking about this, we often turn to, when I teach, a tool called the Sankey Diagram. Who here is familiar with the Sankey Diagram? Raise your hand. Some Sankey lovers. Who has one tattooed over their heart? One, two of you. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to walk you through this because this is a really useful tool. Here are your sources of energy. This is 2020 in the US, which was a consumption in quadrillion BTUs of energy. So we have solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, geothermal, natural gas, coal, biomass, petroleum. Here's energy that's used in the dark area. That's actually useful energy. And the other is what they call rejected energy or wasted energy. And the history of the Sankey diagram is absolutely fascinating. We had Lynn Badia from Colorado State University come and give a talk about how this type of diagram was created after World War II. And I'll give you a little bit more on that history, but really the energy we're using is that dark gray box. The rest is lost in rolling resistance and inefficiencies in our combustion systems, in line losses in our transmission and distribution systems. And then we can think about this across residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors. When we're thinking about this in a policy space, I think we often have a tendency to concentrate on what's closest to us and what we're most familiar with. And so there's a lot of people that really appreciate the ability to do energy efficiency in commercial and residential because that's what we can work on. It's harder to think about this in industrial and in the transportation sectors because those decisions may not be directly applicable to us in our communities, although I'll point later to some areas that are. And then you put these lines all together and you have the energy system. This is the US energy system. The orange box here is electricity generation. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab had a wonderful study that came out looking at the reduction of carbon emissions from the electricity sector from 2005 to 2020, appreciating that it's half of what it would have been if we continued on the business as usual pathway because of the penetrations of renewables, because of the shifts to natural gas. And so I often also think that we're really good at focusing on electricity. And this electricity component is going to change if we electrify our heating and cooling needs, if we electrify our transportation sector. But one of the pieces that I want to just make sure that we talk about, and something that I often worry a little bit about with our local energy focus, is that rich communities will be fine, but that poor communities that don't have the same organizing capabilities or principles may be left behind. And so this idea of equity, this idea of how we ensure that everybody has access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy really is a challenge going forward. Here's New Hampshire. You can see there's very little industrial energy use here, very little commercial or residential electricity generation, most of it going for export, a lot of it going for export from the nuclear power plant. Here's Vermont in 2014. Here's what it looks like after they closed Yankee, just so you can see kind of how that energy shift changes. And one thing that I think is so interesting about these diagrams is they can also show you and share with you politics in America. And so when we look at other states, I've got Alaska, Minnesota, West Virginia, Wyoming. In those bottom two coal states, you can see the importance of coal in the energy systems. You appreciate how and why those states may behave as they do when it comes to climate negotiations. You can appreciate the various importance of natural gas in the industrial sector in Alaska. So thinking about understanding your legacy energy system helps you to understand the politics of energy in your state. It also helps you to understand different pathways that may be harder or easier going forward, and how you need to back it up with other types of policy environments. I'm happy to share all of these slides later because I know some of the print is small. I just wanted you to see the shapes. So in the US, we're really good at thinking about how we're going to change our American energy system, but I just wanted to contextualize this globally. Each box here is about 1 billion people. So on this world of 7 billion people, there are about 2 billion of us with enough energy, whose energy systems more or less work. You turn on the light, switch, you expect light to happen. You plug in your device, and you expect it to be charged. Our systems, the challenge is using less energy and using it more efficiently. We also talk a lot about the billion people on the planet who don't have access to electricity. There are some in the US, but most of these billion are located in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the developing world. 2 to 3 billion without access to clean cooking fuels. And then there are 4 billion people in the middle who have access to electricity, whose energy needs are growing, but whose economic and daily life activities are often punctuated by the lack of reliable electricity. You turn on the light switch, and maybe sometimes you have light. You have to close your factory on Tuesdays because you don't have enough power on Tuesdays to run your factory. And you see the big parts of the world that are driving the future carbon emissions are in these 4 boxes. This is where energy demand is growing the fastest, and this is where the carbon question is the most pressing. So thinking about a world with too much energy, no energy, and also not enough energy is really quite useful as we consider the local and global politics going forward. We can think about that in our own communities too, and Don does quite a bit with the equity questions of poor New Hampshire residents paying larger portions of their income on their energy bills. And so for a map of what that looks like, I used to live in Burundi. I've lived in Kenya and Tanzania too, but Burundi's right here. And 9% of the people there have access to electricity. 9%. This is a country where the annual GDP is roughly $250 per person. And so the inequities in our system and supply make the development goals, and I have my friend over here with our similar sustainable development goal pins. Energy comes in here as number 7, but people appreciate that energy underlies all the other development goals as well. And as we move into the next phase of the talk, this was the context phase. Now we're going into the bad news part. But I think the sustainable development goals of no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, these are ones that we need for our own society as well. It's not just for the developing world, it's for the whole world. And appreciating that energy as part of that is also important. One of the pieces that I've been pushing the last couple of years, and I'm happy to see now a lot more uptake in the area, is that just reducing emissions without simultaneously adapting to our changing climate is folly. We know that grid reliability goes down when your substation is underwater. We know that the transmission system doesn't work when it's on fire. And so the other piece here is that adaptation policy is also energy policy. We need to be reducing emissions while we're simultaneously moving into a world that none of us understand and is changing more rapidly than any of us anticipated. I'm originally from California, and the Western fires the last couple of years have been horrifying to watch. And the changing weather patterns in the Southeast, like Texas storm this winter, and then the flash flooding events like the ones that are affecting communities with the rainfall happening so quickly are forcing communities to really rethink their security components. When Ida hit New York and the flooding in the basement apartments, I mean, I listen to NPR and I cry in the morning. So it just appreciate the fragility of our system, which has not been designed for the world we're moving into, isn't operated for the world that we're encountering now on a more and more regular basis, and needs to be changed if we're going to survive. I also want to point out that when Ida hit Louisiana recently, the people that died from the heat afterwards. They died because they couldn't keep their bodies at a temperature where the organism could live. We can actually change that pretty easily with some technologies, not heating the whole room. I mean, why should this corner of the room have to be a temperature when all I really care about is you? I need to keep you alive. And so thinking also about energy use for our societal resilience, energy use to allow people to wear things to keep them warm or cool so we can survive, I think will become more and more important. I also appreciate how these weather variabilities are affecting our energy system. In the West, the extreme drought is shaping how hydro plants are able to operate. And for the first time this year, having to shut down hydro. And we're seeing effects on agriculture as well. And so within this context, there have been reports for a few years, but I appreciate now that this is much larger, is thinking about climate change as a set of interconnected risks. The green swan, if you will, this type of systemic risk. There was a wonderful interview with Ezra Klein from the New York Times with Adam Tooze, who's an economic historian at Columbia. And they were talking about the systemic risk and looking at climate change as the green swan and how we're using it in European central banks and possibly also in the Federal Reserve to think about these long-term risk and risk management and planning. Yesterday, as I was finishing up this talk, this article in the New York Times came out about the 24 federal agencies that are now categorizing the biggest dangers posed by climate. New York City is doing the same thing, as are all of our communities. What this means for New England, according to my climate scientist colleague, Eric Osterberg at Dartmouth, is potentially larger droughts and more extreme precipitation events. At first, he didn't believe that. He was like, how can you have more rain and more drought? But then in running the models, they appreciated that that change in precipitation patterns actually is providing very, very different patterns and different risk in terms of flooding and flash flooding, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. So the challenge then becomes, how do we create future energy systems that are resilient to these changing risks. And I would just like to make sure that as we're thinking about our local energy systems and reducing carbon, we're also thinking about our local energy systems and increasing our ability to adapt and be resilient. Those two together have to be married in a way that's very, very important. And this is a global issue. While we're dealing here locally, and that is absolutely critical, I think that global context, the focus on equity, is also important as we move forward. So now is the hopeful part, and that is energy futures always change. And I know this next part is going to be very un-New Englandy, but I'm going to ask you to talk to someone you don't know. And I want you to brainstorm how many different ways you can boil water for my cup of tea or coffee. Okay, go, you have a minute. Introduce yourself first, please. That's how we do it. Hello, my name is... Okay, 30 seconds, 30 seconds. Okay, let's bring it back. Let's bring it back. Thank you, everybody. Table in the corner, what's one way to boil water? Shout it out, one way to boil water. Yeah, volcano, geothermal energy. That's what they do in Iceland. What's another way to boil water? Sir? Anyone here? Table right here. Yeah, you. Yeah. What way to boil water? They use the volcano already, so you got to pick another way to boil water.
You could use energy from the sun.
Solar energy, great. Concentrated, perfect. How about this table? How did you guys think about boiling water? Yeah, induction stove. So that magnetic force, electricity going in, you're doing it with electric energy and magnets to do it as well. How about this table over here? How are you guys boiling your water? Microwave, also possible. How about you guys? How are you boiling water?
Wood fire.
Wood fire, yeah. And you can actually make a fire of a lot of things. You can do it out of cow dung, you can do it out of wood, you can do it out of garbage. Lots of ways to make your wood fire. Any other ways that people can think about? Yeah, sir.
Waste heat for car engine?
Yeah, waste heat. So waste heat, thermal thing, like heating up water and getting that base temperature up. And so the reason I bring this up is this is how my colleague Hope Darren starts her classes on her energy classes. Because oftentimes we think about the way we do things today and not thinking about energy services and all the different ways that we could do something. And so what you want is a hot cup of tea or coffee or another beverage of your choice. And what you care about is that it's hot. You don't really care about how it gets hot. And so as we're thinking about our energy transitions, thinking about all of the different ways we can get to the same solution actually frees our mind up quite a bit for how we configure our solutions. And this book is a great book, I think, to give your friends and colleagues for the upcoming holiday season. She talks about how it came out last year, but she talks, and chapter 10 is about keeping the lights on. Chapter 10 is about the energy system. And she talks about how from 1970 to now, we use 3 times more energy than we did then. We use 4 times more electricity than we did then. And while US is only roughly 4 to 5% of the world's population, we use 15% of the total energy use and 20% of the total electricity use. And this change, as she focuses on it, from how things have changed in the last 50 years, I think is really a useful text for those of us thinking about changing over the next 50 years. right? Because we're thinking not the energy as a fixed system, but something that has always been changing, something that has changed in our own lives. And Hope is a professor now in Norway. Before that, she was at University of Hawaii. But in the book, she also talks about her own family's energy use, where her grandmother had a treadle sewing machine. Those of you who've lived in different parts of the world have seen the treadle sewing machines that are still in use today. And for her mother, it was a big deal when she got an electric sewing machine and could use it to make the family's clothes and drapes. And then she talked about how today we live in a world with big industrial sewing machines and our clothes are made in a global supply chain network, probably in another country. And so within a relatively short time frame of a few decades, we've completely changed both the energy used to make clothing, but also the whole supply chain and energy embedded in our clothing. And so appreciating those changes is one that I think is pretty interesting also. And those different stories of how our world has changed, I think also open up our minds to thinking more creatively and more fluidly about how we're going to change and adapt into the future. And so this is the good news part of the lecture. That was change. It's inevitable, whether or not you want it. And this is actually something that Sam talked about a little bit before. This is the 2020 installed wind power capacity in the US. Right now, 122,000 megawatts of wind, 122 gigawatts, all across the country where there's good wind resources. A lot, of course, in the middle of the country. And I am going to give you a quiz now. We do these things so you think a little bit more about the material you're going. But every year, the Department of Energy puts out the annual energy outlook. And in 2000, they put out the annual energy outlook that covered the period from 2000 to 2020. In that report, how much wind do you think they projected? A is 800 megawatts of wind. B is 8,000 megawatts of wind. And C is 80,000 megawatts of wind. And I just wanted to give you the answer of what we actually have is 122,000 megawatts of wind. So how many people think that the experts running the National Energy Modeling Survey predicted A? Okay. How many think it was B? And how many are going for C? Okay, the A's have it. Okay, so we, the experts, were wrong, and badly wrong. And that should give us all hope, because none of us know about the future. None of us know how these systems will change, and none of us appreciate that it's not just the technology, but it's the technological system that shifted. Every year, Lazar puts up, as Sam was talking about, these different cost curves of different technologies. This one only starts in 2009. Wind is in the light blue line there, but you see those costs coming down. Solar is that gray line that's charging down. A lot of the things that when Sam first started reporting were too expensive have come down in cost because of deployment, because of practice, because of a global commitment to making these technologies and making them happen. And so as we're thinking about our system change, appreciating that what we do locally matters, and it's happening in a national context of policies and incentives, and a global context of supply chains, availability, and deployment. We're part of a bigger story, and that bigger story is part of us and what we're able to do. Okay, so now 2 examples. When I mentioned before, the wind piece was a piece that was a complete transformation of how wind worked in the system. With some colleagues at Minnesota, where we have a lot of wind resources, we tried to understand how wind was integrated into the MISO region. Here in New England, we live in ISO New England. The middle of the country is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. So we did a study looking at transmission builds. They had allocated at the time $6.2 billion across the MISO footprint to build more renewables, to allow more renewable energy onto the system. That was very contentious. It ended up in the Ninth Circuit Court. It took about a decade. We did another study that looked at how wind was integrated into the markets. In the MISO region, they had made it so wind actually is dispatched like any other resource. So the variable resource that Sam mentioned before is actually a dispatchable resource. They bid in 50, the day before, but then they true up 10 minutes before they go. And we were curious at how those changes happened. So with my graduate student, Benjamin Stafford, we sat through lots of MISO meetings, read lots of notes, and did lots of interviews. Because this arguably has allowed for the high levels of wind penetration that we now see in these Midwestern states. And I don't want to say it was like watching paint dry, but it was the reliability subcommittee coordinating with the market subcommittee, working with, and all of these different small initiatives that are happening in a bureaucratic agency, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, that most people haven't heard of, has allowed wind to play a dominant role as an energy resource in the Midwest. This was done by technocrats. The environmental community actually hired an electrical engineer to sit in on their behalf, and the community going forward. And this whole process of integrating wind into the MISO market took 10 months. So you had a huge change that affected how wind operates, how you design control systems, what the value of the resource is, negotiated. And now I'm going to tell you my challenging story. So we all know energy efficiency makes sense. When I moved up here, I lived in New Hampshire, and then I moved across the river to Vermont. And that's the little condo complex I live in. And my neighbors were really excited about solar, like most people. But I said, no, 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 no. Before we do solar, we have to do energy efficiency. Eat your tofu first. Right? And Vermont is an amazing place for Vermont and its parent company, VEIC, have all kinds of policies and rebates, zero interest loans, low income programs, preferred contractors to help us do this. So I convinced the condo board, folly I know, to go forth. And with Efficiency Vermont, they helped us write an RFP. We got different contractors. First problem, no one would bid on the job. People don't want to touch multifamily housing. We finally found a contractor, one based here in New Hampshire, who assured us that he would do a great job with foam insulation and this. So then I went to convince my neighbors. And I really wanted to work with Efficiency Vermont on this and do the whole complex because I have some low-income neighbors and some older neighbors who really struggle to pay their bills. They didn't want to do it. They didn't want to do it because it was too expensive. They didn't know how they'd be in the condo or how long they'd be alive. So I had uptake of about half the units. And then the contractor came and did the work. Whoops, back. And now I have a fire hazard. Because instead of taking out the old insulation, he sprayed cellulose on top and has left me with this. Anyone who wants to know the name of the company, I will tell you afterwards. And he didn't do the right blower door test on my neighbors, and now they may or may not get their rebates. Workforce is critical. Workforce is key. We can have the best policies, the best programs, the best support from our agencies, but unless we have real people to do real work, it actually doesn't work. And I joked with VEIC, I'm on the board. I said, you're giving me the full experience. I've gotten to spend time now with the general counsel too. And what I've learned from this, it's A, humbling, right? It's so much easier to do this on my great charts and great models than it is in practice. And B, it's absolutely critical to figure out ways to do this hard stuff. And this is the work that you're doing. You're doing the local energy work that is the hard stuff. And it's absolutely critical because without it, it doesn't work. So sometimes hard things, like integrating billions or thousands of megawatts of wind into the market, are relatively easy. And sometimes little things, like getting a good insulation job in your attic that doesn't spring cellulose on your head, are really hard. So I want to back up again and put us in this global context. Where we are today, where we're expected to go, and what it would take to get us to 1.5 net zero energy. Again, 59 billion tons of CO2 emitted in 2019. We need to get that number down 20% of that level. The US, we're about 6. EU is about 4, and China is about 11. On a per capita basis, the US is about twice what Europe is, and China is about what Europe is as well. State by state, it's actually quite different because of the Sankey diagrams we saw before. So just as we're thinking about our local problem, please make sure that we also remember the global context. So in summary, climate policy is energy policy. Adaptation policy is energy policy. Energy futures always change. And change is easy and hard, but we don't actually have a choice. And so that's the good news and the bad news, right? We're all in, and we're all in. And then rule number 1, we really need to right-size our solutions to our problems and ensure that we have the people to take it forward. I'm really excited to come down here to Concord and talk to you about this. And as somebody from Vermont, I had a small idea for changing the license plate. And I thought I actually brought a Sharpie, but I think it fell out of my pocket, and I was gonna just be out in the parking lot and helping anyone who wants to, a small little Vermont addition to our happy futures together. So I hope you have a super conference, and I hope you're as happy to see your friends are as I am to see you. I wanted to make you talk to each other because that is something that I think we've realized is more important than anything else. We're in this together, and we have to be in this together. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to our conversation. Oh yeah, let me get my...
So we are going to have a brief conversation, Elizabeth and I, and then folks, if you would like to ask Elizabeth questions, I'd like you to start thinking about them, and you can step up to the microphone here in the center and ask those questions. And while you cogitate, we will sit down.
I got the Sharpie.
Elizabeth and I are going to sit down up here, and we're going to have a bit of a fireside chat to start thinking about, to get you all thinking about what you would like to ask.
I can't be seen by that.
Yeah.
Let's go down here.
Okay, we're going to go to the floor. We're just doing it. Which is going to make our video guys scratch their heads.
Got extra video guys here.
So I want to start by asking you about, so I'm a big fan of modeling studies. And there are a couple that I really like that model out into the future what our energy system is going to look like in 2050. You know, what is the most economic way to have a zero carbon energy system? And each of those studies, you know, there's a saying in modeling world, which is all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Each of those studies have assumptions embedded into them about what technologies cost, how quickly those costs will decline. And when you pointed out that in 2000 we were expecting 800 megawatts of terrestrial wind in the United States,
projecting.
Yeah. There can be this tendency to sort of throw your hands up in the air and say, like, expertise is dead, like, don't listen to the experts. And so I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about how you think about how to think about projections into the future without just declaring that experts are useless.
No, I think it's just the opposite, actually. I think it's recognizing that our energy technologies exist in energy systems. And too often we think about a technology without thinking about the system. And really, I can change the value of your wind turbine or your pumped hydro storage plant or your solar by changing the rules on the grid. I can change the value of your plant by changing the siting rules or by decreasing the risk and uncertainty of you being able to actually build what you're trying to build. And so I think the recognition that it's not just the technology cost, but the whole system evolution. And in this case, they had better forecasting technologies for projecting the wind. And that's part of the independent system operators' grid operations. They had changes in the control systems that operated not just a wind turbine, but a wind plant. And a wind plant in a region, and a region in a transmission zone, and a transmission zone in a grid. And so it's this system evolution. And the only change I would have in the title of your conference is I would call it Energy System Futures, because depending on where you are, it's going to look really different. And so expertise is absolutely essential. And we have to recognize that there are so many components that actually create our systems, that design how our systems work or don't work. And that's a lot of it negotiated. And negotiated at the State House, negotiated in the RTOs, negotiated in our communities.
Similarly, when I look at all these modeling studies, many of them, the assumptions that are built into them are technological,
Yep.
and they sort of bracket out and ignore completely political assumptions and political economy. And often I find that that's a real blind spot for those types of studies. And I don't know that I'm asking you to fix them here, but again, when we think about how politics and technology interact, it seems that politics is the more difficult to predict of the two, and that perhaps is why a lot of these types of forecasts don't even try.
Well, I appreciate that question a lot. I mean, I did my dissertation work when I was at Carnegie Mellon on carbon capture and sequestration. And one of the things I appreciated, one of the reasons I got interested in this topic, was everywhere I went and talked about the technology, it was a different technology. In New England, there were beautiful laws on the books that said, we're going to do this. You don't have the geology to store billions of tons of CO2. This was just like pretend legislation. Down in Texas, it was seen as a really useful place to be able to get EOR to produce more oil. Right? Enhanced oil recovery. You're going to get the CO2, inject it down, produce more oil. So it was seen as a very utilitarian technology within their system of providing cheapest. In Montana, it was a technology that was going to allow the coal industry to continue and allow jobs for Montanans. In Minnesota, it was a technology that was a subsidy to North Dakota. And you don't want North Dakota to win in hockey, and you don't want to pay North Dakota to more for your energy system, right? I mean, so regionally, the technologies were so different. And we saw the same thing with wind. We looked at wind in those same different states. In New England, all of the stories were about Cape Wind, and they were in the editorial pages. In Texas, in the Houston Cron, 70% were in the business section, because at that time, wind was cheaper than natural gas, and it was all a business play. And the state put in $6 billion to build out transmission for new wind. In Minnesota, it was seen as a way to help rural development and farmers. And they've developed some financial mechanisms called the Minnesota Flip, so small farmers could take advantage of the production tax credit that usually only helped big banks. And so every place you went, that technology was different. In Montana, it was a technology to help, wind was a technology to help Californians drink green lattes. And they didn't want that. Send those Californians home. So that context really matters. And I think people locally have a logic that makes sense for that place. And being able to understand what that logic is really important. I mean, as a non-New Englander, one of the things that I think is amazing is the policies on the books are beautiful. I mean, the energy policies in Vermont, in Massachusetts are great. But when you talk to developers, the risk of siting, of actually getting a project done, adds so much to the cost that people aren't interested in investing as much in our energy futures. So that kind of tension here, I mean, it's a beautiful place to live, but if we don't actually make it work for us, it's not going to work very well.
One of the things that in this new job I've been saying sort of over and over everywhere I go, and I'm curious to know what you think of this, is the technology makes the politics easier, right? So as breakthroughs accumulate, things that were impossible become possible. Things that were impossible become profitable, and businesses bring their voice to the table and start to push in ways that are credible and that can move the politics. Hey, do you think I'm on target?
Well, I think no one wants to be number one, right? You always want to be number three. And that's borne out in research. Like businesses that are innovators may have the great idea. It's usually the ones that come second and third that get the market share. Because your costs are less, you can focus on different things. So, we can let California and New York experiment, and then the rest of us pick those solutions. And I think you're right to some degree, but I also think there's really important local logics that are also part of that story. We did a paper a few years ago looking at siting of zero carbon energy technologies. And in some parts of the world that think of themselves as picturesque versus utilitarian, you have really different energy conversations. And I think we're remiss if we don't also consider the equity components of these conversations. As the disproportionate effect of COVID has affected communities of color, so too do heat zones, so too do kind of a lot of the past historic harms of our energy systems. So we're thinking about rural communities, we're thinking about poorer communities, we're thinking about communities of color. I think it's very, very important that we have that equity conversation woven into how we think about our future energy systems also. It's way too easy to put the pipeline in the poorer neighborhoods than it is to put it in the richer neighborhoods in our current system.
So I'd like to remind folks, I have a tendency to just never shut up.
So ask your questions.
It's
Let's
a real
hear it, guys.
problem. So the only way to get me to shut up is for you all to step up to the microphone and ask better questions than the ones I've got. Great, thank you. I'm glad that the last thing, as he's stepping up, I want to ask one more question, which is that I'm glad you listened to Ezra Klein, and I learned
Ezra's amazing.
I learned an expression from his podcast that it comes from modern money theory, which is anything we can do, we can pay for.
Oh yeah, that was the one with Adam Tooze.
Yes.
That was a fabulous, if anyone wants to listen to that one, that was fabulous. The other one with a book that was fabulous was Annie Murphy Paul, that talks about the extended mind, but how we actually exist in community and we make decisions and work together going forward. So I also want to make sure that we get some women up here too. I've been at way too many conferences where we've only had the nice gentlemen come to speak, and I want all voices in this conversation. So please, sir. It's Bernie Sanders. Oh, sorry. With the
I'm running
mask,
for re-election. Yeah.
From Vermont, you know.
Is this on? Hello. Anyway, so we're trying to convince more and more people.
Who are you? Tell us.
Oh,
tell
sorry,
everyone.
Steve Holmgren. I'm on the Durham Energy Committee. We're trying to convince more and more people to buy green power, through whatever ways. But the question came up: is there a possibility that we drive so much demand for green power that we're actually outstripping the supply and are going to drive green power prices up? Any ideas about that?
Well, again, this is a global story, and right now the flood of capital into anything green is unprecedented. And some of the conversations in that talk also about if you strip out different ways of thinking about this. And I think there's a realization that the supply component of that is something that's ramping up. I remember in those first studies that you were talking about too, where you couldn't have more than this much wind, part of it was we couldn't imagine ramping up our supply chain issues. And that has happened. I think in this post-COVID world, these are really good questions. And you've seen these fluctuations before with different crashes, with different commodity prices going forward. And if the future were certain, we would know it already.
Hi there, I'm Bill Hopwood.
Where are you from, Bill?
Hopwood Incorporated.
Nice to meet you.
How viable do you think carbon capture and sequestration is, given its current cost, the efficiency of it, and do you think this leaves a door open for more fossil fuels? California is looking at how they're going to get to net zero, and they did a study, 100% renewables. They had to add 13 cents per kilowatt hour, probably for T&D. But they are looking at natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration to make it net. How viable is CCS in your opinion?
So I think this is a question that's a context question. If you're thinking about natural gas production offshore where you have to strip off that CO2 anyway before you put it into the pipeline, re-injecting it like they do in Sleipner or Snøhvit in Norway is a much less cost solution than if you're capturing it from an aged coal plant, piping it hundreds of miles and re-injecting it. If you have a value stream like a CO2 project, it's a little bit different as well. It's a complex technology, and any complex technology has such system dependencies involved in it that it really depends. It's a technology that could take place in some parts of the country and probably not in New England. It's a technology that could be important, especially if we're thinking about a world where we actually do need to get to net zero. There's a really nice piece by David Keith in the New York Times last week that talked both about air capture and CCS. He was my advisor in grad school, so it's always nice to see what he's up to. But I think these are all really good questions. And honestly, I worked on this technology 20 years ago, and I stopped doing it because I got tired of what I called PowerPoint plants. Lots of proposed projects, and I think it was a very important political technology because it allowed the coal states to see themselves in a carbon-managed future. But I think how it plays out in the future It's really different if we're thinking about stripping CO2 from steel making or cement, or if we're thinking about retrofitting old fossil plants. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yay!
Hi, I'm that woman you've been looking for.
Yay, I've been looking for you.
I'm Kat McGee from the House Science Technology. and
Nice
Energy
to meet you, Kat.
Nice to meet you too. My question, my sideline is as a program and project manager in technology, and the thing that has struck me about how New Hampshire is approaching energy is that we lack a strategic plan. And I noted, I don't know if you saw recently, Maine took a huge leap legislatively by committing to a plan and then putting a whole bunch of legislation in support of that plan so that they can hit it from a number of different angles. And I am a real fan of that, because what I see here is a very frustrating one step forward, two steps back kind of policy making, which gets us inconsistency for business, and what you spoke about before about how even the new businesses are not going to want to play here. So it's a multi-pronged choice to lose, and I don't see us acknowledging that or even discussing it. So I guess what I want to know is, do you have experience with other states besides what Maine has just done, who have actually tried to? My understanding is that recently some states have moved the same way, strategically, saying, this is the best choice for this is the best choice for that. These are the ways we're going to get it done. Because we don't even have any commitment at this point to, net zero by whenever. We couldn't even commit to 2050 on the emissions commission that I served on last year. So I just wonder if you could talk about the economics and the viability of committing to a plan, which doesn't mean everything's perfect. It just means you have one and then you can adjust.
No, I think this is a fantastic question, something that I was talking about with a colleague at the Danish Technical University yesterday. And we were talking about how Denmark has always had an energy plan. I don't know if you appreciate that during the oil crisis, they didn't drive on Sundays because they didn't have enough oil in the country. And so all these pictures of people picnicking on the highways were really part in this kind of Danish mindset. And so this idea of not having an energy plan in their mind turns out really badly. And so even though Sweden has gone more free market and said this and that, Denmark has kept with their plan, much to the chagrin of some of the economists. And so I think you want to look bigger than just the US, because there are other places where this is happening as well. And when you talk to business people, what they're looking for is certainty. What they're looking for is the ability to operate. I was talking to our Irving Center for Energy and Society was funded by Irving Oil Company, as well as Arthur L. Irving, the founder. And I think about that as the legacy infrastructure investing in the future. So thank goodness we have people in the legacy system who are willing to put resources to helping us build our future system. And he talked about how he's supposed to make 30-year investments to meet the regulation, but not have a license to operate for 2 to 3 years. So how do we think about helping companies in this uncertain time where maybe we can't provide the certainty that they need, and then what does that look like? I think having a plan at least brings people together to be on the same page. And your question of economics is also really a question of our time, where we have, the market is a tool. The market is not an answer. And there are some places where that tool is appropriate and some places where you need other ways of thinking and engaging to make things actually work. So, sure.
Nat Balch, Durham Energy Committee.
Wait, there are 2 of you guys from Durham Energy Committee. How many of you guys are here?
More.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Happy to see Durham Energy Committee folks here. Everyone from Durham Energy, raise your hand. Where are you guys? All right, okay, you got 2 of you. Okay.
So partway through your presentation, you had that great slide which showed the proliferation of wind power across the United States. And you had those 3, the multiple choice question, where you had 122,000 megawatts
That's what we've built.
versus 800, which were estimated. What was the prevailing wisdom which led people to estimate so low?
That one was driven. There's actually a really nice report written about this that I'm happy to send you that Lawrence Berkeley National Lab did on this topic. So I think it's a really interesting case. It was driven by cost. It was driven by what they assumed the cost of wind would be, but they also had other constraints on wind in the system in terms of transmission availability, in terms of how much you could have on the grid, grid operations. And at the time, you know, like you were saying earlier, there was an assumption that if you had more than 20%, the whole system would go down. And last winter, SPP, the Southern Power Pool, the other side of my side, I think they had 78%. SPP. Southwestern Power Pool, SPP, yeah. Sorry about that. They had like over 78% of wind penetration at one point. So numbers that were impossible to even imagine before. And so that piece of what we assumed was impossible, we actually do regularly today. I think it's a really powerful message for all of us. And I think it's also important for us to recognize that the whole system changes, not just the cost of the technology, but also the reliability, the ability to operate in different wind speeds, how things actually work. And so offshore wind, yes, and they still need to bring those transmission lines onshore. And we still need to integrate them into the grid. And we still need to have energy efficient homes that use less energy than we do today. Because right now, having it go out through the roof is a really inefficient use of energy, as is a fire hazard. So I want to, oh, good, come on. I was just going to blurb on there.
I'll let
We're
you know.
good? Okay.
So
And
my name
who
is-
are you?
I'm Audrey Nelson. I work for the Vermont and New Hampshire Energy Education Project. I'm an educator.
Great.
And my question is about equity.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear a lot of lip service paid to equity, but when it comes to like, okay, we want to do this as fast as we can. We want to make sure we're building new technologies as fast as we can and implementing them as fast as we can so that we solve the climate crisis. Yes, solving the climate crisis helps everyone. However, I'm just afraid of this like business as usual because that's the fastest way. These people are already trained. We're going to use them to build it. These giant companies are already incorporated. We're going to use them to be beyond petroleum, and it's just like the same old disequity that we have today, inequities that we have.
How are you thinking about that? I mean, how are you thinking about that in your organization? It's something that we struggle with in my office.
I just don't know, like, I mean, certainly when talking with students, I hope that they can see the value of thinking about equity and having everyone's voice at the table when you start a project, not just like, okay, what do you think after we've already decided what we're going to do?
Yeah.
But I don't see that reality in necessarily some of the bigger corporations. And I just wonder if you think that regulation is even possible or probably like or able to keep equity as part of the conversation, or if the business powers that be have enough power over our government to just keep going and like, yes, this is our new green energy policy, but sorry, we're not going to deal with the inequalities in our society.
No, I think these are really good questions and ones that not only you're struggling with, but everybody's struggling with. And the recognition that the world we live in has some of the highest levels of income inequality for the last 100 years makes having that conversation in this time, in this country, really, really hard. I mean, the reason I started with local energy New Hampshire and then a picture of Don, not just because he's an extraordinarily good-looking man, but that was for you, Don. We're friends. I just have to harass him a little bit. But it is because that tension is real. And when you look at New Englanders who are spending a huge proportion of their income on heating fuel and energy service over as a proportion of their income, it affects rural communities disproportionately. It affects poorer people disproportionately. And that has to be part of our conversation too. But I don't think we cannot do what needs to happen on climate because of the energy poverty. We have to do it because of energy poverty. So we had a talk, I've been trying to do events that bring in two different perspectives to create a space of conversation that's larger. We had Eric Osterberg, the climate scientist that I mentioned, and at that time, Shalonda Baker, who is an energy justice lawyer at Northeastern. She's now the Department of Energy's first ever head of their Energy Equity and Justice Office, Energy Justice Office. Tony Reams, another colleague at University of Michigan, who's also in our speaker series, is there with her. But he talked about how, future climate's going to affect New England, and she talked about the equity and justice perspective. And that gave us the room for the conversation to take a space of how do we think about this world? How do we think about adaptation, mitigation, and justice in a world as we move forward together? And so what you're talking about is real. What you're talking about is a priority of this administration. Whether or not it stays a priority going forward, I think we've all appreciated how our political system can give us whiplash of our necks and souls. And so I want to be part of that conversation going forward because I think it's too important to not address. And
I was just going to say, I think we have time for one more question. Sorry.
Okay, one more question, then I have to do a blurb on the Irving Institute and invite you to all of our events in the future. We're going to have a new building. Jazz hands.
Hello. I'm Jules Good. I'm not really in this field, but appreciate that the intersection of clean energy and climate justice really applies to a lot of different areas. And I guess my question is maybe kind of specific, but we talk about clean energy and the implementation, and it feels like kind of a numbers game where just like with lots of policy, where we're trying to do the things that are going to help the most people. And I find that the disabled community, and particularly people with complex medical needs that rely on having consistent power, in order to stay alive, are left behind in that conversation quite a bit. And I'm wondering if you know of any initiatives to kind of keep that community top of mind as we're working on the transition from where we are to where we want to be.
I think that's a really important consideration, and I've been really interested in thinking about energy and how energy intersects with critical sectors of society like healthcare, like education, like transportation. But the healthcare survival piece and the communities at risk, I think is very, very important. When I pulled that last little slide from the on the Sustainable Development Goals, it was from a UN report page on disability and sustainable development goals. And so this is part of a larger global conversation, and I want to make sure that you know about that, because I really want to make sure that we're able to incorporate that into how we think about that as well. Because you're right, when you lose power and you need to have dialysis, when you lose power and you need to be able to have oxygen, it kills you. And so thinking about those populations in particular in times of risk and energy system reliability, I think is absolutely critical. So thank you for bringing it up. I really appreciate that. I'm going to blurb really quickly on our Irving Institute for Energy and Society. So we were formed in Dartmouth in 2016, and by a gift from the Irving Foundation, and we're focused on really including this next generation of students to push and work in the energy area. So we work in research, education, engagement, and I just want to invite you to be part of our conversation. I mean, this energy in society doesn't actually happen without society. So we'll have a new building that opens up, and like most campuses, it will be an energy efficient building. LEED Platinum is what we're going for, which will be great. The piece that I still struggle with is that the other 9 building projects on campus aren't held to the same standards, right? It's great to have a flagship, and every university campus does. Georgia Tech, Princeton, Smith was our talk on Wednesday on this issue. But we need all of the buildings to be able to meet these same standards of performance and not have it cost engineered out. But I want to invite you up there, come visit. And then also we have tons of online events. We'd love to have your voices. If you have any ideas for speakers or people that you think would be good, just contact us. These are 2 that are coming up: Do Environmental Markets, Cars, Environmental Injustice. Danae Hernandez-Cortez from Arizona State. We started a series for assistant professors, postdocs, and researchers because we wanted that new energy voice to really permeate how we think about the world and to showcase their research. And then we have a whole series. Our theme this term is buildings, because we're moving into a building because there's other buildings on campus. And so Stephen Doig, our colleague, is going to be working on telling about his project on retrofitting the Empire State Building. He did the first round of energy efficiency retrofits and is now doing the second round. So it's an iconic building, and it's interesting to hear about how you actually make those energy efficient. But I want to just extend a warm thank you to all of you, and hope you have a super conference. The work you're doing is very, very important, and I'm just privileged to be able to be here and be in conversation with you. So thank you very much.
So we will have a brief cookie and coffee break outdoors, and well, out those doors, and then the panels will commence. So you know, we are live streaming the ballroom today, and so we have selected a panel from each session that will be here in the ballroom. So you'll see on the doors which of those panels is going to be here in the ballroom as opposed to the room that the track is in for the rest of the day. So just be aware of that. Enjoy the cookies and the coffee. I would once again like to thank Elizabeth Wilson. I think the most daring part of that slide was where she suggested that we change the live free or die license plate. I assume that there will be no rancor directed towards her because of that. But thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the conference. Look forward to seeing you out there.